Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Jeremy Pekarek. Jeremy is an archivist curator at Indiana University Northwest, where he manages the archives and special collections, which include the Calumet Regional Archives. He's the co-author of a book chapter for the Association of College and Research Libraries, published multiple essays, and published over 200 book reviews. He has presented at state, regional, and national conferences relating to his work in archival theory, management, librarianship, and historical inquiry. Before IU Northwest, he was appointed to the academic rank as a senior assistant librarian under the title of Archivist and Instructional Services Librarian at the State University of New York at Portland. Previously, he served as a visiting assistant librarian at SUNY Portland. Jeremy also served as an adjunct faculty member in the Computer Applications Program, where he taught credit-bearing courses. He is a graduate of Cayuga Community College and State University of New York at Oswego, with a BA and an MA in History, and Syracuse University, where he received his Master of Library and Information Science and Certificate of Advanced Study in Cultural Heritage Preservation. He is a certified archivist from the Academy of Certified Archivists. He earned a certificate in Diversity, Equity, Inclusion from Cornell University. In today's presentation, Jeremy will be covering the genealogical records available at the Northwest Archives and Special Collections. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for the introduction. I really appreciate your time today and providing me into your class. I'm so happy to be here. If I could just make one quick note, I have authored over 20 book reviews, not quite 200 yet, but maybe I'll get there. But I'm very, very happy to be here. So I'm Jeremy. Feel free to just call me Jeremy. And so today we're going to talk about the Calumet Regional Archives, which is a very interesting archive in Indiana University Northwest in Gary, Indiana. And so let's get started. Okay. So I'm going to start with myself and then go into the archive and what our purpose is and why we exist, and go from there. So you already noted in the introduction that I was actually, I did a lot of my education in Central New York, but my family is actually from the Chicago area. And so we spent some time there when I was a kid, and eventually moved to New York, where I grew up. So if there's any Tolkien fans out there, they'll get the There and Back Again reference. But so I was basically around the area, went to New York, and then came back as an adult, which is where I am now. This is a photo of me and my son. And so I'm not going to go into my education or career because we covered that in the intro. But I am an archivist at IU Northwest, and I'm a lone arranger. So what that means is that I pretty much process the collections myself. And so I wear many hats in my institution in terms of processing and digitization and archival management, reference questions and research, and outreach. And so I try to do a little bit of all that, all the time. And so and the way I've always viewed collections is that they are a series of different stories. That's my personal take on archiving. I try to make it relatable, and then I want it to be impactful first and foremost. My view on an archive is that it's not a place where materials go to die. It's a place where materials go to live. And so my job is to help bring those stories, those collections, to life, and to make sure that they are being well preserved, taken care of, and appreciated. So I want to start out, before I go into the collections, though, I wanted to note, you'll see this Juneteenth banner, and I put it up there because I wanted to talk about, since this is a genealogy class, I should note that I'm not a certified genealogist. I'm an archivist, I'm a preservationist. And there's some overlap there, but there's so many wonderful things that genealogists do that I'm learning and I'm picking up from as well. So I'm a lifelong learner, and I'm going up through those motions. But I wanted to bring this banner up real quick because this is the project we did last year for Juneteenth, and we created a mobile banner that could talk about the history of Juneteenth. But in the center of the banner, there's a story of a man named John Eubanks. And he was a local resident here in Gary. And so we did a little genealogy research ourselves here on campus. So I wanted to share John's story before I go into our collections and resources as an example. So John was enslaved in Barron County, Kentucky, and he ended up escaping slavery, um, fighting for the Union Army in the Civil War, and then towards the end of his life, he moved to the city of Gary. And John has just a fascinating story about how he met his wife and how to having over 50 grandchildren and great grandchildren, and this is a photograph of John paying respects at a local cemetery here in Gary, Indiana. He was honored in our parade in 1937, our Memorial Day parade, and you see he's wearing a uniform. It's not a typical Civil War uniform, but he's in uniform paying his respects at that time. John would pass away, shortly thereafter. He lived to be 98 years old, and he's buried in a local cemetery called Oak Hill. And so I came across John's story through the WPA narratives, and I saw, there were some interesting things in there, and I wondered if we had anything in our collection that related to John. And so I started to dive into our materials, and I didn't find anything immediately that was in our materials, but I did find other online resources and other items. And so we ended up locating John's birth certificate and his death records. We located some of his military records. John has an interesting last name. His last name is Eubanks, which you can see on the headstone is EU Bank. Some materials is listed as Eubanks with an S. In some materials, there's no E. It's just Eubank. And so it's an interesting way to search because there's variations of how he appears. So aside from just looking into John and who he was and his story, I actually I contacted the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, and they helped me do a little of this research in this genealogy because they're also genealogists. And we ended up going to the cemetery to try and find his headstone to pay our respects to John. And it was covered with vegetation, couldn't see it, couldn't actually find it. We had to have the cemetery come out and use their sextant to find the headstone, which took some time. And then they located it. We resurrected the headstone. This is a photograph of the process when we were cleaning it, or Pat Cave of the Sons of Union Veterans cleaned it. And then shortly thereafter, we actually placed it upright in its natural position. The cemetery laid down new sod, and a flag and a medallion was laid in John's honor. And I ended up contacting a woman named Angela Venable through a Facebook group. And Angela helped me do some research on John because she had started it as well. And she, turns out, long story short, she was a descendant of slavery herself from the same plantation that John was enslaved on. And so we made this connection. We're actually going to go present at a conference next week on some of this history. And it was just a fascinating story that we got to resurrect this, part of John's life. And when we did that, we found out that all of the materials that describe John say he's a private, but his headstone says that he's a sergeant, which is the only differing materials or evidence that we had, which is very interesting. So I just wanted to share that quick story with you and let you know that, I'm not a genealogist, but last year we did dive into a little bit of work, and it was extremely fascinating. And I appreciated that type of work very much. So let me go into our own collections with you. So the Calumet Regional Archives is located at, in Gary, Indiana, in IU Northwest. And our mission is really to, of course, collect, preserve, and make records available that relate to our local areas of the Calumet region. The Calumet region is pretty vast with, covering not just Indiana, but also Illinois. But we primarily document Lake and Porter counties and parts of LaPorte in Northwest Indiana. Our collecting scope is pretty broad. There's really no other collecting institution like ours in the region that covers such a wide region like the Calumet region. we're one of the most unique in archives in IU because of how much we collect in terms of community archiving. On the bulleted list there is a list of subjects of types of materials that we have collected within the last 50 years. We have materials related to labor and politics and health and medicine and industry, arts and music, entertainment, and so much. You can see the list. There's also sports and athletic history, which is not on there. We've got over 500 collections, over 7,000 photographs, and over 5,000 audio recording materials. And last year we celebrated our 50th anniversary since we were founded. And we were founded by two history professors, Dr. Lane and Dr. Cohen, at IU Northwest. And so I started here only a year and a half ago. And so I got to come into this role of having a well-established archive, small staff, because I'm a lone ranger, but big archive with a big impact on our community. And so I'm very happy to be here and to make that happen. Our mission, just like any archival mission, is to do three things. So we are expected to collect information, to preserve that content, and then to find ways to make it available. And you may know, as genealogists and researchers yourselves, the making available part is the most difficult aspect of that wheel. Certainly there's a lot that goes into collection and outreach and working with donors, but then also preserving it and buying materials and supplies and having space to do all that. But making it available you can do that in numerous ways, from digitization to creating indexes to online inventories and finding aids, to letting people know that the collection exists and just knowing that it's here and you can come in and make an appointment and actually schedule for your research. Of course, we try to reach as many distant researchers as possible through an online means. But as I mentioned, I started here a year and a half ago. I think my mission moving forward is going to be, what can I do with digitization efforts with our current archival collection? And so that's where my mind's going to be for the next, I don't know how many years, but so many years, 20 plus years, and to try and do that third part the best that I can. So I mentioned the Calumet Regional Archives, which documents the Calumet region of Indiana, but we also have a university archive at IU Northwest, which documents our history of our campus. And the type of materials we typically take in are original historical value that have rare and unique value. We try not to do a lot of duplication or mass publications, things of that nature. Newspaper diaries, university records, correspondences, memos, and so many other types of materials that usually have original value. We try to bring in our primary sources, of course. So some of the projects I'm going to share with you that we're currently working on, we're looking to preserve the story of Gary Roosevelt, which is a local school that is now closed in Gary, Indiana. It was the first African-American school in Gary, Indiana. They have a long history, a rich history. And I'm working with an alum named Pauline Tatum and trying to create a space online for people to submit their reflections about Roosevelt and what it meant to them and who they are and what's their career path. Did you develop friendships? Do you have a favorite teacher or anything like that, to provide a broader narrative of the school. We're also working on an oral history project called I Am IUN, which is about documenting our own story as a campus, which we're interviewing students, staff, faculty, and alumni. And the students are the ones who are really doing all these interviews. We are just merely guiding them in that process. We are currently updating our finding aids. That is a process, if anybody's ever done that. So we had an old web page, which is our current web page, and we're trying to migrate that content into a new web space while simultaneously updating those finding aids and inventories. We're trying to provide description for over 5,000 audio recording devices that are currently within an internal database that we have. So we want to make those more available, and that we're trying to work on discoverability. One thing that popped into my mind as I was invited into today's class is that it might behoove us to look at a genealogy LibGuide. We're just putting resources, our own local resources that we have to offer to a broader community. Okay, now let's actually get into our collections as I promised. What you're seeing here right now is our online repositories and resources. Indiana University as a system has many online repositories. They go by different names. There's like Media Collections Online. There is Archives Online. There's IU Digital Collections. There's IU Scholar Works. There's AIM, which is the Archives of Institutional Memory. And we've got collections in a few of those, not all of them, but a few of them. And we're trying to pull that into our webpage so people can see those resources. But I wanted to share with you that aside from those Indiana University resources, we also have outside resources as well. Over the years, even before I stepped into this role, many, many years beforehand, we had several genealogists in the area collect data and create indexes on some of our collections, which they've published on their own web spaces, which is a huge help to the community as well as the university archive. And the Lake County Public Library, which is our local public library system, has been very involved in digitizing a lot of records, even records that we have duplications of. And we've been working with them on even sending some of our additional copies if they had a gap in their collection. And I'm going to get to what some of those collections are in a little bit. But at the end of this presentation, I'll try to put some links into the chat so you can actually see what these online collections look like, so you know what I'm talking about rather than me just talking about them. But before I move on, I'll real quickly provide you a very brief overview. So IU Archives Online, which is that second name that's mentioned in the bullet point, that's where our finding aids will live. Then IU Media Collections Online is where any media collections currently live. So if oral histories, digitized content for moving images would live there. And then IU Scholar Works, which is traditionally an open access publishing webpage for the university, we actually put our indexes on there. And so that there's different spaces where our materials do live. But we do have several fully digitized collections that are available to anyone from anywhere. So the first collection, and I should note that these digitized collections are courtesy of my predecessor, Stephen McShane, who served our university for almost 40 years before I came in about a year and a half ago. The U.S. Steel Gary Works collection, which is a fascinating photograph collection. U.S. Steel is a big part of Gary's history. It's why Gary exists. We have all of their records here in the archive. The Inland Steel Photograph Collection, which of course makes sense. We have their whole collection in our archive as well. That is a huge photograph collection. It's very big. I can't remember how many photos off the top of my head, but that is fully published online. Last year, I worked with the Michigan City Public Library to help digitize or make content available from oral histories on transportation back in the 1990s. So folks sat down for an oral history interview in the 90s about their role they played in Michigan City, which is only a stone's throw away from Lake County. It's not that far. And we've had those in our archive for many years. But last year we sat down with our institutions and we made it work where we were able to get those online and made available to the broader public. And transportation, it varies from developing the South Shore Railroad line to those who worked for Pullman Standard to those who may have been involved with early aviation efforts and things like that. So they're very important oral histories. And then the Stephanie Smith and Steve Mark collection is a beautiful photograph collection that really relates to our dunes and our environmental history. And so you can check that out as well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our different types of the collections that we have, and then I'm going to break them down for you so you can see If some of our collections have digital content, if they have descriptive content, meaning indexes or finding aids, and then some that right now just have physical context that aren't have any online component. But I want you to know like how much we have been collecting over the years and the types of resources that might be helpful. As I go through these, I want you to keep in mind that we work with researchers from all around the world. Last year, we've had several people fly in from the UK. We have people from some of the local larger institutions, like Notre Dame and Northwestern and University of Chicago. Folks reach out for quick questions, but also we have people who come in from Florida and somebody who flew in from Oregon, and just looking to see our collection, which is really unique within the city of Gary, but also the Calumet region. This photograph, this is the other half of that original photo that I showed you in the beginning about our reading room. And I'll just quickly point a couple things out in here. First, the large photo on the far left, that's Albert Gary. That's who we're named after for the city of Gary. Chairman of the board, U.S. Steel, back in 1906. Right next to him, there's a photograph of Ida B. King, longtime educator at Gary Roosevelt. The books you'll see right there, that's the beginning of our reference collection. There's a whole nother wall you can't see that has other materials. But there are census records in there, city directories, indexes, and other industrial indexes and other materials. On the top shelf, that's our photograph, or I'm sorry, that's our phone book collection. In the back there, you see those large bound white volumes. Those are all of our marriage applications for the region as well. On the other side of that aisle is where a lot of our government records live, like land plots, transfers, sheriff fees, claims dockets, things like that relate. You would typically find in a recorder's office or in a clerk's office. So I'm going to begin with Steel Shavings Magazine because I think it's fitting. Our archive was founded 50 years ago, and around that time in 1975, 2 years later, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Lane created this magazine called Steel Shavings. And in the beginning, Steel Shavings was an opportunity for students on campus to interview their neighbors, their family members, their professors, people that they knew, to create a broader history of the Calumet region. So it was a written oral history. And that lasted all the way until around Dr. Lane retired. And then the magazine sort of transformed into Dr. Lane's experiences since he was no longer teaching. And it's still going. There's another issue was just published last year, and Dr. Lane has been still active with that. But I bring it up because a lot of people tend to use this as a reference resource to get some really good information on a topic. An example of that, the cover in front of you is Gary's centennial issue on the history of Gary. You may find names, people, dates and regions, different businesses and information like that in these magazines. Now, they are not digitized, but they are indexed. So if you were to go to our web page, which I can show you at the end too, you'll be able to see what names appear in Dr. Lane's issues. So if you were doing research on Vivian Carter, for example, who is the co-founder of VJ Records. VJ Records helped bring the Beatles to the United States, actually, which is why they came to the United States, because of VJ in Gary, Indiana. You could look up Vivian Carter in the index and see where she's mentioned over the years in terms of the magazine. Dr. Lane refers to his work as a first draft of history, this magazine, because it's really kind of getting into Gary's history that was largely untold when this started, or well documented, I would say. Our next set of records I want to talk about are educational records. You can see the yearbook in front of you is from Gary Roosevelt. And we do have a yearbook collection of local high schools. And we share that collection. So when I say share, I mean there's a yearbook collection that exists at the Gary Public Library or the Lake County Public Library. But a few minutes ago, I mentioned how the Lake County Public Library was actually digitizing some content of duplicated collections that we have. And we, though we have an extensive yearbook collection, Lake County has been really putting in the time and the effort to actually have these scanned, digitized, and made available online through archives, archives.org, or the Internet Archives. And you can see those collections by going through either our webpage or going through the Lake County Public Library's webpage. And they've been a very helpful and local resource to our community. School enumeration records. So this is something that in the past our collections have started to preserve, or our campus started to preserve. Though we have the original enumeration records themselves, like I said, our partners over at the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society actually took the time to create indexes for those records, which are available and are used quite a bit. And that's another project too that we're working with Lake County Public Library on too as well, because they're also putting in time and the effort to scan those. So it's good to work with our local partners and to make sure that we're working towards a collective need and a collective good. Online inventories, though, of physical collections we have in the archives. Some notable collections I want to point out is the William A. Wirt papers. William A. Wirt was Gary's first school superintendent, and he is a notable name for national history. He created the school system called the platoon method or work, study, play. It ended up being adopted nationally throughout the country, and it was also known as the Gary Plan. Gary was revolutionary in designing how we teach. And we have his complete collection in the archive. Now, though the collection is not digitized, the materials are described through an online inventory or a finding aid. You could actually see what materials actually exist. And the same goes for the next collection down, the H. Theo Tatum papers. Tatum was the second principal of Gary Roosevelt, and really he was a long time serving principal and is really responsible for many accomplishments, including its athletic department and raising the bar in educational standards. And so his papers are preserved in our archive. I like to point out that in the next slide, I'm going to talk about city and regional collections. So we'll talk about the City of Gary collection, but I put on this slide school directories. So our school directories exist within other collections, our regional collections, actually. So that's a point I wanted to make, because oftentimes we may get a question, and that question is going to span out into multiple collections that we have, whether they're original items, whether we're looking at indexes or reproduced items, or really looking at our regional collections, which cover a lot of areas as well. And that's a good segue into our regional collections. So our regional collections are broken down by county. So Lake County, Porter County, LaPorte, but also by city within those counties or towns. So the City of Gary collection, for instance, is one of our largest collections, over 900 photographs, one of our largest of the regionals, over 900 photographs, and it's broken down into different series. We have church history or religious history, we have government history, we have different community organizations, education, ceremonial and events, and then so much more. It's really an extensive collection that gets heavily used by our patrons, also by our news outlets. It's not uncommon for a news outlet to reach out to us looking for photographs for them for publication. And the City of Gary collection is fully described online. I think it's one of our most interesting collections because it documents the history of Broadway. And if you're not familiar with Gary, Broadway is the main strip in Gary, Indiana. And it really, right now, it runs all the way, into Maryville, which is the next town over, and into downtown Gary, which is where like City Hall is. And Broadway was that main drag when Gary was founded back in 1906. And we have those photos when Broadway was part of the dunes and really a dirt road. And you can see it develop over the years, which is really incredible. but our photos are described by the item, not by the folder or by a series. So if you go to our City of Gary collection, you want to see what photos we have, it'll tell you Broadway and Fifth Ave, photograph 1933, or Gary Roosevelt, 1959. So we'll describe the item, which is really helpful to the researcher. In terms of digital materials, again, I can't thank the Lake County Public Library system enough because they've been going through and also digitizing the city directories. So though we have physical copies of the directories, you can now go in and actually search the digital directories as well, which has been very helpful for our patrons and patrons in general around the area. Inventories. When I say inventories, I'm referring to like finding aids are descriptive materials, but maybe not necessarily digitized, just describing what our materials are. We really have numerous regional collections. Again, the City of Gary collection is the most heavily used. Then we go into the City of Hammond. I would say that's our next largest collection. But the city collections are very interesting because we get a lot of donations, and sometimes we get a lot of small donations. You know, I was in orchestra in school, and I have this program. And so we might stick that, instead of creating a whole new collection, we might put that item into one of our regional collections that helps tell our regional story. And again, when I get to the end here, I'm going to hopefully share some links with you all so you can see what these online resources look like. But I definitely want to go through our records so you understand what the scope of our content is and how we collect and why we do that. Our local business records and organizational records, some of our largest collections. We have a lot of local unions, steelworkers unions, for example, that are described and inventoried in our collection. I mentioned U.S. Steel and Inland Steel, some of our largest collections in the archive. Both are inventoried and described and are available for research. The Pullman Standard collection is very interesting. I'm sure you all remember learning about Pullman and the steel strike, and the strikes like of 1919, as well as what happened before that. But Pullman is an interesting collection because we have really Pullman collection that relates to Northwest Indiana, because Pullman is so large. There is a Pullman collection that exists at the Newberry Library in Chicago. Of course, there's the Pullman Historic Site in Chicago, which also has a research center, which has their own collection. And so we're one of the big three in the area that has like a third of this collection, and ours relate to our area. But I bring that up because that is indexed. So if you wanted to see employee cards of those who worked at Pullman over the years that related to Northwest Indiana, you could search that through some of our indexes online. Again, courtesy of the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society, who really put in all that work to create those indexes. And then the same with some of our local companies like the Gary Screw and Bolt Company or the International Institute of Northwest Indiana. The International Institute is an interesting collection that is really we have case files of those who came from other countries that settled here in Gary. The International Institute also donated the other interesting materials such as pageants that they would put on, and plays and community involvement, information on the classes that used to take place, how to learn English, for example, or how to learn different laws and customs, materials on finding local resources from housing to positions and employment, and really played an important role in Gary's beginning, and it still exists to this day. And so that is a very important and interesting collection. Government records. Oh, here you go. Now you can see the other side of that aisle that I was talking about earlier. So so we do have several online indexes for our government collections that I will point out. You can see that most of these are the very large bound historical books that you might find in recorders or clerk's office. The white bound volumes in the end there, those are our marriage applications. So we're in Lake County, and Crown Point at one point was the marriage mill of the United States. What you might think of like Vegas today in a way. But there was no waiting period whatsoever. People would come to Crown Point to get married in that moment and then have a certificate as well. And our trying to think off the top of my head, I think they go from the 1890s to 1920s is what our applications range from. But some of the other books from the left and the right of that aisle relate to different estates, land sales within Lake County itself and Porter County. We have information on those who are insolvent taxpayers, different dockets, criminal court index cards. We also have different licensures and certificates, which I am going to mention in the next slide. And when I say like licensure certificates, I mean like we have state issued dentist licenses, Lake County nurse licenses, physicians licenses that exist in the archive. So we have those physical items being preserved, but over the years that local genealogy society did create indexes for them as well and put them on their own webpage that are available to see. Some other additional physical collections that we have are the Methodist Hospital School of Nursing, which has an important history within the city of Gary, as well as the St. Mary Mercy School of Nursing Records. The image on the screen is an example from one of our local diplomas, and that is of Consuelo Ornales Garcia. Consuelo has a very, very interesting story herself. Her family came to Gary during the Mexican Revolution. She was born in Gary. She ended up becoming Northwest Indiana's first known Hispanic nurse. She was actually accepted into Indiana University, but at that time, there's various campuses within IU. We're at the Northwest campus. At that time, you had to actually drive to Bloomington to complete some of your clinical work, which is a very taxing. And so she did not complete her degree at IU. But I bring it up because when she passed, sadly, in 2004, she actually donated her body to science, which she just has an amazing story. And she ended up becoming a head charge nurse at US Steel, which we also have that collection as well. And we did a big exhibit on Consuelo last year, celebrating her and who she is. And that kind of ties it into what I said in the beginning, that we believe that our collections tell stories, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to tell those stories, and we're being appreciative of that. Her collection, not digitized, but her collection is fully described now and inventoried, and the finding aid just went online last week, so we're very happy with that. Environmental collections. People may not know that our region is the birthplace of ecology. Actually, Dr. Cowles, who came down from the University of Chicago, did his research at the dunes, which now part of our dunes is a national park. We also have a state park and then local parks. And but that's a really important part of our regional story and our regional history. I mentioned the Stephanie Smith and Steve Mark collection, which is a photograph collection. But we have the Save the Dunes Council records, maybe less important to genealogists, but because there's not a lot of family history probably through Save the Dunes, but there is a lot of important history I wanted to share. One of the oldest environmental activist agencies in the United States helped actually turned in, I'm sorry, excuse me. This agency has been around since the 1950s, and they still exist, and they helped create this national park that we now appreciate. And they donated all their records to us, so we preserve that information here at IU Northwest, which has a rich photograph history. The photograph you see in front of you right now is the dunes in Northwest Indiana being excavated when US Steel was going to be coming in, which is really incredible. But I bring these collections up because our environmental collections are also inventoried and have finding aids associated with them as well. So I mentioned we have 500 collections, and a lot of those have some level of description, at which you could use our keyword subject index to search for names. and I'll show you where that is in a minute. We have political collections. This photograph is of Mayor Richard Gordon Hatcher, who was elected in 1968, the first African-American mayor of the city of Gary, but also one of the first African-American mayors in the United States of a metropolitan city. We have congressional collections, senatorial collections, and mayoral collections that all relate to Indiana, which is just, it's a lot. It's really fascinating to be part of those. Some of the congressional collections we have are used constantly. There's so much information in there, especially if you're looking at local history, that people tend to request all the time. And newspapers. I want to close out here with newspapers. Lake County, Indiana, does not have a lot of digitized newspapers. I think it's a huge opportunity for us to look into this further to see what is available that we can digitize. The photo you see in front of you is from IU Northwest Phoenix. That has been digitized. We are just now waiting for it to be available publicly, to be accessed by our patrons, our researchers, our community. So that is something that will be online very soon. But we have the Gary Post-Tribune collection in the archive, and it's actually multiple collections. It's very interesting. We have the bound collection from 1956 to 2000, although this newspaper goes back further than that into the early 1900s. We have the bound physical collection for browsing. We also have a library collection on the newspaper, which includes a series of clippings, which are broken down into subjects. And then part of that, we have their photograph morgue for the newspaper. So those who appeared in the newspaper from that same time frame, roughly 1950s to 2000, we have the negatives of those who appeared in the newspaper. And those are indexed yes, those are primarily indexed. And we can at least search them. But again, even this paper in general, the Gary Post-Tribune, it's not digitized. There's not a keyword index for the entire paper. It's very difficult. So I think that this is a huge opportunity for all of us in the region to look into what are our newspapers and how can we better serve our community by making sure we can get some things online. The Gary Post-Tribune is now, I believe, owned by the Chicago Tribune. But aside from that, we do have several newspapers that are in the archive, which are listed below there, like the Gary Crusader, the Info, which is now called the 4-in-1. U.S. Steel and Inland Steel had their own newspapers and newsletters over the years, and we have those as well, which get accessed quite a bit. And so this is something that's a work in progress. But before I show you our digital resources, I want to, of course, reiterate, I wanted to say thank you for allowing me to be here today and to share some of our resources and our story and who we are as an archive. I'd be happy to show you the links that I've been mentioning throughout the presentation, and I'm also happy to take some questions.
All right, I'll open the floor to the class. I noticed in the chat box, Melanie said that she's been to your archives and she thought it was wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, Melody. Thank you for visiting. Oh, you were born in, oh, wow, in Chesterton. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and you know Dr. Lane. Oh, great, great. Who's still very active with our history.
Bill in Texas wants to know, any white sequin gloves in your collection? Michael Jackson?
I didn't hear the first part of that. What did you say?
Bill from Texas wants to know, are there any white sequin gloves in your collection? I guess I'm assuming from Michael Jackson.
Not the memorabilia, no. We do have some materials in our reference collection, of course, published research on the Jacksons, but also we do have some information on them from their talent show days, like from early on. So some of the Jacksons actually did go to school, by the way, at Gary Roosevelt, and we have some of those records of Roosevelt. But we have a photograph of them outside of Inland Steel, all together, which was a big turning point into them becoming who they would become. Actually, Gary Roosevelt was a place where they started with their talent shows that really launched them, which is incredible. Not a huge collection, no, but we do have some items.
You mentioned your VJ collection. I think I have at least one album, I think at least 145 RPM from the Beatles on VJ.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a huge Beatle fan.
Let me ask you all real quick. Are you still seeing my slides?
Yes.
Oh, you are. Okay. 1 second.
Do you mind actually going sharing your screen and going to your website and navigate the website with us?
That's what I'm going to do right now. Yes. So now do you see our webpage?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. And you can get to our webpage just by going into the library. And then on the library home screen, there's just a link that says archives, which brings you here. And so this is where you can get a hold of me. You can make appointments. You can obviously request information. We can have a conversation about what you're looking for and how I can best serve you. But like I said in the beginning, we do have two types of collections. There's the Calumet Regional Archives, which is the history of our region, and then University Records, which is more like our campus history. So, and I'm going to go into Calumet Regional Archives because I think it's most relevant. So from here, you can click on collections, and it's broken down by different subjects. You could click on a subject to see arts and entertainment, which would include Vivian Carter. Or if you scroll down further, you can look at just what are our photograph collections, postcard collections, slides or maps or architectural drawings that we have in the archive. Now, in the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned about projects, about how we plan to move things over from an older web page into a newer web page. I'll show you what both of those look like in a minute so you can use both of them as you do research. But this comprehensive list brings you to all 500 collections. And then this one right here where it says Archives Online, that's the newer web page that we will be migrating to at some point. So let's go. So you can see this is our older web space, but you can browse the collections this way. So city and regional collections, which I presented on, and then more subjects from there. Now, two things I want to point out. If you see something that's in red, it means you can click on it and there should be a described inventory or a finding aid. If you see something that it's not, there's no link associated with that, that means it's still a work in progress. We haven't gotten to that part yet. So, but at least you know what collections do exist and what you can access right now in this current period. But I'm going to open up the City of Gary collection as an example. And you can see here that though there's not a lot of description, like in a traditional finding aid, there is an actual inventory itself of what appears in the collection, down to every folder. And this is a fairly large collection as well. So if you were looking for materials on, say, Gary Roosevelt, you could certainly do a quick Control F, Roosevelt search to see what exists, which is what I usually recommend. If you want to look at our photographs of this collection, you would click on the top for the series photos. And then you could see what each individual photo is of. And this one's really interesting because it describes it to the actual item itself. You see this one's a photo of Broadway north from 8th Avenue from 1908, which these types of photos get used quite a bit. So let me go back to our collections again real quick. Because I want to show you a described collection as well. Vivian Carter. So here, aside from the inventory, there is a level of description and background history that you can get from actually accessing the collection, which is important, which is ideal. We want to add description to our collection so people can see why they're important, how you can use them, and what the contents are. And this is the older space. The newer space is going to look a lot like this. These are some of the finished collections that we have processed that are in there. So like the Reverend Julius James papers, Dr. James ended up he went to Morehouse College with Martin Luther King Jr. And when Dr. King went to Boston, James went to Gary. Dr. James ended up bringing Dr. King to Gary 3 different times and speaking at his church. And we have this collection, which was donated by his late wife. And so here is the overview, the ideal looking finding aid that we're describing. And then you would see the contents of that collection as well and be able to click on them and see, more information from there. I'm going to go back into the older system for now because that's what most people are familiar with, and also it has the most content in it right now. So aside from looking at our master list of just browsing the collections, you can do a keyword subject index or a keyword search. So if you were looking for collections that related to, let's just say the city of Gary. So we'll click on G. And so all of these collections do relate to Gary. Or it might be more specific than that. Gary Air and Pollution Advisory Board. Or if you're looking for a specific person, like the Bishop Andrew Goika. We have a collection on him. He was a prominent bishop in the area. And so we're trying to add a level of description over the years and to make it easier for you to find people and names and topics and events and just subjects in general. Let's see, what else do I want to show you? Okay, so aside from our collections here, I'm going to click on some outside links that IU does not maintain, but that do relate to our records. The first one is the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society, and they have been a big supporter of the archives over the years, which we really appreciate their time and efforts. But they created various indexes of collections from around the county or counties, and these do not all relate to us, but you can see some of them do. So for example, government books at Indiana University Northwest, Calumet Regional Archives. You can click on the links and then view the actual indexes further from there. So as potential resources. This particular index is an index for the books itself, not for the names that appear inside of the books. Another example of a web page that we have is, or not that we have, but the Lake County Public Library. If you look at their genealogy resources, like historic yearbooks, a lot of these do physically exist in our archive, as well as other places in the region. But Lake County Public Library took the time to actually digitize and put these online, which has been very helpful to the area. And then there's one other collection that I did not scroll through. Actually, no, one second. Sorry, I know I have so many tabs open. Bear with me. So I'm back to our original archives webpage. If you go to reference materials, you can find all the links I just mentioned. Here is the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society records that you could look up, which by the way also includes our local cemetery records, which are very helpful. They were helpful to me when I was locating the history of John Eubanks, who I mentioned earlier. Local high school yearbooks, which were done by Lake County Public Library, which we link out to. You can also see what our actual physical yearbook collection is by accessing our Excel spreadsheet. Below that, you can see what city directories we have access to, but then again, the Lake County Public Library digitized those, so we link out to that, and our telephone book collections as well that you can see that are available. Now at the top here, it does say IU ScholarWorks. In the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned some online resources. IU ScholarWorks is an open access publishing site for Indiana University, but we've been using it for our indexes. So if you wanted to see some of the indexes that I've mentioned throughout the presentation, which again, are all courtesy of the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society and the volunteers that the time they put in to create these are not created by myself. These are created by that community who's really done a fantastic job. So a good example, the criminal court index cards that I mentioned earlier, those are indexed by names. Our insolvent taxpayers, again, by names. So if you're doing a lot of family history, this particular page might lead to a lot of names and hits that way. Here we have employee records at the Gary Screw and Bolt Company. We also have the physical collection for that. Let's see, let's go to page 2. Another one I wanted to bring up. Oh, here's the Pullman Standard Railroad, the personnel records for that, the index. So if you're looking up anybody in the region who may have been associated with Pullman, this would be a good one to look up. So we do have company records, we have government records on here that might make it easier to help you with your searching. Again, I can't thank those involved from NWIGS, which is the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society, who actually put those together, that we are just simply linking to, and we appreciate that. I'll open one up so you can see how to actually do that. So with this one, you click on the title, and then you're going to actually click on it again. And here's the file itself, which is a PDF. And then here is your physical index. And then last but not least, I mentioned on my last slide that newspapers are a huge gap in Lake County. If you go to Hoosier State Chronicles, that's a really good resource looking up our historical newspapers in Indiana. You know, some of these counties have a lot in there, and some of them are a work in progress. I would say Lake County is a work in progress. The only paper we have in there right now is the Hammond Times, which we now call the Northwest Indiana Times. And it's very limited. It's from 1906 only to 1922. And so there's a huge gap in terms of online searching for our newspapers. The Gary Post-Tribune was one of the main sources of news in our area, which then turned into just the Post-Tribune, which is now owned by the Chicago Tribune, which is still running and going forward. But we have those in bound print copies. Our local public libraries have them in microfilm, but it's something we need to do more work with moving forward. Does anybody have any additional questions? Anything I can answer?
I'll open it once again to the students. And while we're waiting for some more questions coming, I have a couple actually.
Sure.
I know here locally in Reno, the University of Nevada, Reno has community collections where past genealogical societies or lineage societies that have, you know, the chapters or the lodges have become defunct. They collected their records, like from the SAR, the DAR, you know, for chapters that have closed. Do you also do the same thing?
We do. And if you can see my screen here, you'll say community organizations history. So we do try to collect that information as well. I've actually been going into our local Rotary clubs, and I've been giving presentations on how to preserve that history now. But even the Gary Historical Society, by the way, which still exists and operates, and the president over there, Linda Jones, is a huge resource. They actually keep their records with us in the Calumet Regional Archives. So we preserve that there. But some good examples, we have Lions Club's records. We do have the Gary Rotary Club records. We actually have the Northwest Indiana Genealogy Society records, which are right here, who have played a role in helping us document some of our collections. So that's a great question.
Well, that's good to know. Really good to know. Let's see here. George in the chat box wrote down, while many newspapers have been digitized, there are many still available only on microfilm or in bound volumes at archives. Progress is being made. Indeed.
And it's a tough one too, because, you know, they're usually very large projects and very, you know, high cost projects, grant funded in typical situations. And, you know, my last institution, we ended up getting 4 grants to digitize all of our student newspapers, which was a huge success for us there, which became a major resource for the campus. Well, our student newspapers are already digitized. We're waiting to get them online, but Our community papers, though, the ones we access every day when we wake up and we're seeing what's going on in the world, and those are not currently available to the mass public in historical prints, unless you're looking for physical imprint volumes that have been bound, or the microfilm versions, which were mentioned in the chat. And though they're still available to use and utilize, which is good, it is still a very difficult process to get to them if you don't have years or specific dates that you're looking for. And so it's certainly a challenge. I feel like I wanted to say something else about that. No, maybe not. Maybe not. I'll leave it right there.
You had mentioned school yearbooks that the public library had done, and I noticed, you clicked on that link and it showed the years
Yeah,
they have in the school books. But what about the yearbooks you have? How far back do your yearbooks go?
that's a great question. Let me go back to our collection itself. I want to say off the top of my head, our yearbooks go back to the 1920s, 1930s. And, the city of Gary, we have yearbooks that relate to Lake and Porter counties because it's a pretty big collecting scope. But the city of Gary itself had multiple high schools, including Wirt and Emerson and Roosevelt, and Frable and so many others, that we're trying to document all of that history, alongside our community partners with the Gary Public Library and the Lake County and some of our other historical societies. But if you are interested in seeing what our yearbooks are, you can browse through our whole list, which is right here, which this was recently finished as well. And we break this down by city and then school. So without doing a quick keyword search, I'm fairly certain our oldest yearbooks come from the 1920s. And there's a 1926, 27 right there. I don't know if we have too many that are before then, but yeah.
Gosh, that's great. You mentioned your political collections.
Mhm.
Do those political collections also include letters from constituents?
I want to say they do. I would have to go into some of the collections and to answer that better. If you were to scroll down onto the master list there, you'll see political history. And so like this is Congressman Madden, Congressman Adam Benjamin. This is Mayor George Chacharis of Gary. I'm just going to click on Adam Benjamin real quick. And this is a fully described finding aid. Yes, right here, constituent correspondence.
Oh, wonderful. Wow, that could be a gold mine.
Yeah, that was a really good point too. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. This collection does get utilized quite a bit, also because of how large it is. And actually, let me see how. It's just, yeah, over 70 boxes. It's just, it's described very well. My predecessor did that. And it really breaks down the different subjects that are available. And so if I'm not finding a lot of luck in the keyword search index when I'm looking for something, I usually come to some of our largest collections, like our congressional collections, where they may have been involvement in so many different things. And I try to run a search there as well to see if anything's coming back, and there might be a relevant folder or something along those lines.
Now,
That
you
was a good
mentioned,
question.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just said that was a good question.
Oh, okay. You mentioned that you were doing oral history. I assume that you're actually recording it with audio. Is that correct?
So we're doing video recorded oral histories.
Oh, video. Okay, not just audio.
That's right. So we're doing the IUN project, which students are actually doing, and it's almost completely run by students. It's not part of a particular class necessarily. It started out through us in the archives, working with some of our folks in the Center for Teaching and Learning, as well as our good folks in ODEMA, which is the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs. And so we really wanted to create a project that not just helped shape our campus story, but also helped create a sense of belonging and to foster student relationships, like people knowing people and people, meeting each other for the first time and really growing our campus in a collegial experience. And so they have been recorded in two spaces. We've been recording our interviews in the archives with low-tech options using a ring light, an iPhone, and mobile microphones. And then we've been doing a high-tech option in our AMP space on campus. And AMP stands for Academic Media Production Space, which is where professors go to record their videos for classes, which has got a green screen, it's got, high-tech microphones and sound equipment and video recording equipment. And our person in that area, Tamika White, has been helping us out recording these in two different spaces. So we launched it this semester, and we've done 30 interviews so far.
That's great. We've been working on an oral history project here. It's been really slow to get off the ground through our English department. We're doing it as like a narrative essay on audio.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to get it up. And of course, here in the genealogy lab, we also encourage a lot of oral history recording, and we use StoryCorps.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's really incredible. Yeah, it's been quite an experience so far. We're diving into these things, but there's so many different fields that exist in some fields, right? Like I'm not an oral historian by trade. I'm an archivist, but archivists also do oral histories and other things like that. And so we learn so many new things as we go through them. And in our particular project, we wanted it to be student-centered. So not only are the students doing the interviews, but they were trained by other students. So our communications department, our students who have already done interviews for like our media and things like that actually came in to train our students who volunteered. And then they also created their own marketing materials to help push the project out to reach to other students. And it's been really quite a process. So we've been sitting back as faculty and staff and kind of guiding it through, but really all the credit goes to them for taking on the role.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So I wish you the best of luck, because it's really a fun and rewarding experience, especially when you get to sit back and listen to some of the interviews.
I found here in the genealogy lab, once you do one oral history recording on StoryCorps, it's really easy to do more and more. In fact, last summer we had the nationwide convention of the Daughters of Norway here in Reno. And I taught a couple classes there on recording your oral history and putting it on StoryCorps. And like I said, once again, it's just getting them to do the first one, and then the second and third and fourth and fifth one is a lot easier. It's just convincing people to get over the fear of being recorded.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. That's good to know.
Well, I have one last question, and then I'll open it back up to the class. Who is your typical genealogy patron, and what is it that they come in looking for?
That's a good question. So to answer that, let me give you some context. And so we get questions from all over. I mentioned earlier about some folks who's traveled in from other universities in the UK and Florida and all that. We get a lot of professional and scholarly questions, which is, I think, our biggest attraction, I think, based off of the scope of the collections we have. But we get so many local history questions from our community that live here that want to know more about not just our history, but also their families and their stories. And so I'm not sure if we have a typical question, but I'll give you an example from last week. I had a gentleman come in and he said, I don't know what I'm looking for. I just know, here's my name. This is a little history of my family. This is where they settled in Lake County. What can we do to find more information on them? And we pulled up some of our indexes. We looked into some of our local collections, like our regional collections too, our yearbooks, and we started searching for names. Aside from all of the other resources that do exist through like Ancestry and all those other resources that you may be familiar with, we tried to use what was available in the archive to help out. And he ended up spending, I don't know, a couple hours here, and he was just, shocked by how much we had, that we had to take a break and say, all right, this is where we're at for now. We can pick this up the next time we come in. And I think the marriage application records actually ended up proving some of the most valuable in that case. And which are also very interesting too, because like Rudolph Valentino came to Crown Point and he signed the marriage, and his application's in our archive. And so people find that fascinating. But um, aside from that, aside from the questions we get a lot of involvement from people saying, I did this. What do I do with it now? So I know I created this bound version of my family history with my family tree and photographs and records, but I don't know what to do with it. And then they will donate it to us, and then adds to our family history collections that we have that are available for research, which is just very important. And then on top of that, I teach classes on how to preserve family history. And then when I'm in there, I ask people to bring in their items and their artifacts, and we talk about it and we have a broader discussion. And so I bring all those examples up because I feel like we don't have a typical question. We get so many different types of questions that come into the archive. It's a new learning experience every single time for me. So I'm really appreciative of that, but it's also sometimes challenging as well.
Wow, okay. What are your current hours? And do you need an appointment?
Good question. We highly recommend an appointment. So I mentioned I was a loan arranger. And so you may catch me in there if you just happen to knock on the door, but you're far better off trying to reach out to me either over the phone or email, or use the appointment form that's on our webpage. And then we actually set up a time that works for you, because you might catch me while I'm up there, but I want to make sure that when we make an appointment, you have dedicated time to utilize the room and the resources that you need for your research, rather than me having to run off to a meeting in 20 minutes or something along those lines, and making sure it's available. So we do accept walk-ins, highly encouraged for appointments.
And what do they need to bring with them if they were to come in person? I mean, do you have to put your stuff in a locker before you go into the archives?
No, we ask you to sign in, but we don't really restrict you and your contents. We have a coat rack. If you need to hang up your coat, put your bag somewhere. But you're welcome to bring in a laptop. You can bring in, a notepad. We recommend pencils over paper. We provide you with gloves if you need them. We actually can provide you with notes if you need them. And the great thing about our library is that you can get a community patron card downstairs at the circulation desk. And then when you do that, you'll have access to the library computer that's in the archive. So you can use your own sources or own resources that are online by using the patron dedicated computer that's in there while you're working.
So even if you don't live in the state, you can do that?
It might be difficult to get a library card in Indiana if you don't live in the state, but we can work with you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. Let's see here. Bridget says in the chat box, thank you, Jeremy. I live about 2 hours away. Although I have no family ties to the area, I'd like to see your archive.
Absolutely. Please come on by. And we get those questions too. Quite a few people are like, I've worked here for 20 years. I've never actually seen the archive. Can you show me around? And so if you're just interested in doing a tour, I would be more than happy to show you around the archive. It's really a fascinating place. I mentioned 500 collections. If you try to put that in perspective, we have 7 different rooms. We have half of the 3rd floor that's really up here. And it's quite a place. I'm really happy to be here. And so please let me know, and I'm happy to give you a tour.
Okay, we'll give the class one last chance to either unmute their microphone or put something in the chat box for Jeremy. Give it a few seconds here. Okay, well, Jeremy, it sounds like all the questions have been answered. So thank you very, very much for your time. And I really appreciate you allowing us to record. And our marketing department will get that up on our school YouTube channel as soon as they can.
Well, thank you all very much for allowing me to be part of your day today and your class. And I look forward to future communication. And thank you so much. You have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And before I stop the recording, I'd like to invite the entire class to stay for the second half of class. And with that, thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.